Space Telescope Science Institute prior to joining the ISS. And for 5 years, he worked on the Onboard Data Interfaces and Networks group, and then as a communication and tracking officer before being selected as a flight director back in 2005. So he's been at this for a very long time. He was the lead flight director for Expedition 15. He worked several ISS assembly missions, including STS-122, 123, and 124, and then was the lead on STS-130. And then he was also on the ATV-2, which was the Kepler mission. And he works with Boeing now on the commercial crew program CST-100 Starliner vehicle, and I've definitely got some questions about that today. He was an undergraduate at University of Michigan, received his PhD in physics and astronomy from the University of Toledo. And this is the 20th year of astronauts living permanently in low Earth orbit. And we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Bob Dempsey. Welcome, Bob.
Welcome, Dr. Bob.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. First, before I get going, I'm really glad to see that you've got a director of swag here at NASA. That's some wild ass guess. So it's cool that you've got a director of it. I'll also apologize to begin with. I know we're all weird in this virtual world, and I'm not used to giving a talk sitting down and not having, standing up and gesticulating. So we'll see how it goes, especially since it's the end of the day. But it's my pleasure to come talk to you guys. As he just mentioned, I am an astronomer by training, but after working on the Hubble for a number of years and actually doing research, and it was fun seeing those asteroid stuff because originally when I got my PhD, I always thought I'd be working in solar system astronomy and working out at JPL, and then got over to Hubble, and then found my love of operations of spacecraft and got down to NASA here in Houston and been working on the International Space Station for a long time now. So I do still have astronomy in my heart, and I also was impressed by your cloud observations. When we used to do public observing at the Ritter telescope in Toledo, we always had to explain that our cloud filter wasn't working when things weren't working. So anyway, let me get right to my talk, and let's see. Are you seeing my blue screen of PowerPoint?
We see it.
You got the blue screen.
Okay, so I'll tell you a little bit about what a flight director is and stuff as I go along, but as you mentioned, this may sound like a very odd thing to have to deal with, but I think you guys will find it was an interesting puzzle that we got handed. And all the time people are talking about rocket science, and to me this really illustrates what rocket science is. So I hope you enjoy hearing about it. So I'm not talking about that kind of refrigerator, but instead I'm going to be talking about this kind of refrigerator, the Early Ammonia Servicer, and I'll explain that in just a moment. And as I go along, please don't hesitate to ask a question or stop me. I'll allow some time for questions at the end, but if you have something I'm going along, I don't mind being interrupted.
Okay, good. I'm just going to assume that the way you throw a refrigerator out in space is you drop it through the frigid air.
Nice try.
Had to do it.
Okay, I'm a flight director, and not many of you may be totally familiar with what that is. I know Josh, you would be, but this is me. Well, actually, this is Ed Harris playing Gene Kranz, one of our first flight directors. But this is essentially what I am. And when Gene Kranz was selected, that was the first time we had 3 flight directors going around the clock 24 hours a day. So they picked team names, red, white, and blue. By the time I came along, they were out of colors, and I wanted to honor my astronomical background. So my call sign and my logo is Galileo Flight. And this is my patch. I'm actually wearing it right now. We're very big on patches and logos here, but that's just a little bit of my background. So here's mission control, or what we call flight control. And this is a picture of what you've probably seen on NASA TV and stuff. This is the control room. And each one of the people sitting here is in charge of one of the systems on the space station, the electrical system, the communication system, the life support system. And I'm the gentleman there in the brown coat there that you're seeing the back of, the flight director. And you can think of that person as kind of like the conductor of a symphony. Each of these people are the experts that are operating their system, and I'm trying to keep everything on track. And this is a picture you can also see on the video screen up there. That this is one of the last space shuttle missions when the shuttle was approaching the space station. And I'm not going to go in detail, but this is just kind of an example where this shows, these boxes show the different positions, attitude control and guidance, for example, life support, as I mentioned. And we're there 24/7, 365 days a year, monitoring and operating the International Space Station. And as noted, next month, we will reach the 20th anniversary of continuous manned operations. So it's been, not many people realize it's been that long, but it's been an amazing adventure. And I'm going to tell you about one of those adventures. So just real quick, I could give you a whole talk just on building the space station and everything that was involved. The first element was actually launched almost 22 years ago now. That was from the Russian side. And then, as I mentioned, we've been permanently manned since November 2 of 2000. And there was 3 crew members for a number of years. Then when the Columbia was grounded, we had 2 for a little while. And then in 2009, we've increased, that's a typo, that should say 6 people, not 9. We sometimes surge to 9 when we have a handover, but it's normally 6 people. To date, over 240 people have visited the space station, and we are currently on our 63rd manned expedition. And what they normally do is they go up for 6 months at a time in groups of 3, because that's what the Russian Soyuz escape spacecraft uses. So it's been over 21 years, a lot of shuttle launches, almost 140 Russian vehicle launches of cargo vehicles, manned Soyuz vehicles, European, Japanese, and commercial cargo missions, and hundreds of spacewalks. Building and maintaining the space station takes a lot of time going out there doing spacewalks. The assembly sequence of the space station, and what was key was, I don't know if you can see my mouse as we're going along here, but these solar arrays, each one of them went up in the space shuttle, but with the arrays obviously rolled up, like kind of like a window shade. And early in the assembly, before we had this truss long segment that goes from left to right here and holds the 4 ginormous panels, one of them was installed in the center here and rolled out and provided power as we were building out this structure. And then it was, the solar arrays were rolled up, and then the robotic arms used it and put it out here on the port side, and where it was re-extended again. So that was, at the time that I'm going to be talking about, that was the upcoming mission. This solar array was actually still on the center of the space station and was getting ready to be moved out to its permanent position. And here's just a big picture to show.
Can you give us some idea on dimensions?
You're a perfect straight man for this. Here's the dimensions of the space station right now over a football field. So you can see the truss segment here basically goes the entire length of a football field, and the solar arrays are the width. The manned structures here are these closed cylinders in the center here, and that's about the equivalent of a 6-bedroom house or a 747, depending on what you can better visualize. And it's almost 1 million pounds of structure.
How much power did the solar panels actually generate?
Each one can generate about 11 kilowatts. And, you know, right now we're still at surplus power generation, but, you know, they are degrading over time, and there is a long-range plan in a few years to attach some extra solar arrays because they are degrading over time. And we're hoping to extend. Right now, we officially have agreements from the partners and the US to go to 2028. We're hoping to extend that beyond that. So, you know, we got to make sure that the solar arrays are getting there. And we're also adding new modules and equipment. So it's always more power is going to be needed.
Where is the alpha spectrometer?
That's a great question. The alpha magnetic spectrometer, which is an awesome astronomical unit, telescope. I don't know if you can see my mouse here, but it's out on the truss here. Can you see my mouse, or is that not coming through?
You can see it.
Yeah, so it's right about there. One of the amazing things about it is that thing just produces, you know, gigabytes of data. It's an amazing amount of information that it's downloading. Okay, so let me get to the fridge part now that you get a little bit of a feeling for what the station looks like. So in 2005, as a flight director, I was assigned a question, what to do with the Early Ammonia Servicer, or EAS. And here's a picture of it when it was installed. And this, you can sort of see the little bit of a tip in the upper left of this picture of the gold thing here. This is the solar array I was talking about that this was attached to that had to be moved. So here it is. Here's the big refrigerator we're talking about with two of the astronauts to give you an idea of size. This is him waving after he installed it. And it's being permanently, or I should say temporarily mounted to this structure behind it. And it's kind of relevant here, but this little pin with three little things sticking out of it, this is how the robotic arm grabs things like this. A lot of people think that it's normally like a claw that like can reach stuff. That's only in science fiction movies. Actually what it is it's like wires that can tighten up around a pin, if you can see my hand gestures here. So the wires tighten up on the pin, and then kind of some indentations align with those three little beveled marks. And that's how you can grab it and move it around. So why was this installed? And again, you know, we didn't have a rocket big enough to launch the space station all at once. It had to be launched, like I showed you quickly in that previous picture, in like 37 space shuttle missions and a bunch of Russian missions. So it had a kind of a temporary configuration that was built up over time. And early on, we had what was called the external thermal control system. You know, the computers and everything generate a lot of heat. You also need to be able to cool it. So we had a temporary thermal control system. And until we installed the permanent one, we were using what was called the early external thermal control system. NASA's never very clever with their acronyms. So it was a temporary system that was out there. Now it was cooled by ammonia. It works just like kind of your standard air conditioner where it takes heat into a fluid. That fluid then goes to a radiator where it radiates it out into space. The thing is, it was ammonia. That's a very efficient radiator. But of course, as you know, it's toxic too. But the plan when we launched it in 2001, it was launched and temporarily attached to the P6, that's the photo cell 6 truss part that I was showing you to, in August of 2001. And when we launched it, it was just going to be able to, in case that early system leaked, so that we wouldn't lose any cooling, we attached this thing and the astronauts could go out and basically hook up a hose and refill it. So it was kind of like, you could think of it as putting out, refilling the radiator of your car in an emergency. Okay, now the video that I had tried to show you before, this is the interim state of the space station building. So here's where the truss has been attached and a couple of those big solar array panels have been attached to the space station. And then that temporary one I was talking about, the P6, the solar arrays have been retracted here, and that's what you see here. And the upcoming, the mission that was coming up, the space shuttle mission was called 10A. That was the 10 American assembly mission. It was the 120th space shuttle flight. And the plan for that was when the shuttle was docked, it would use its robotic arm and the space station would use its giant robotic arm, and I'll say a little bit more about it, but it's an 85-foot long robotic arm, to basically take off this solar array, hand it to the shuttle, then the station robotic arm would move out here. See how it's moved out portward a little bit? And then the shuttle robotic arm would hand it back to the station arm. And then this arm would basically turn it around and stick it on the outside here. And then we would deploy the solar array and everything would be good. Easy peasy. Now, here's what this creature is. You saw a picture of it, but here's kind of a cutaway. It's about 635 kilograms with about 136 kilograms of ammonia inside of it. So basically just a storage tank. And here is one of the arms that we could, that's fixed to the space station. This is that robotic grapple fixture I was talking about, but this is the capture bell that locked it onto the space station. And here's kind of a cutaway of what's inside. There's a couple pressure tanks and then a big tank of ammonia. Okay, so we wanted to move that truss structure over to the permanent position of it. And there was a concern because this was never meant to be permanent. In fact, the plan was to attach it temporarily and then bring it back in the space shuttle. But a lot happened after we attached it, one of those things being the Columbia disaster. So we were faced with 4 options. Just accept the risk, because the problem is that capture mechanism that we were talking about wasn't designed to hold the Early Ammonia Servicer on the P6 truss as it was being moved over to its position. And we were really worried that it could just snap off. And then you had this giant piece of material floating near the space station and very likely colliding with it. And for those that remember the Mir space station that was hit by an unmanned cargo vehicle, it doesn't take much to bump into a space station and do a lot of damage. So one option, we just take we grit our teeth and hope it would hold on, hoping that the engineers over-designed it a little bit, but we weren't sure that that would happen. But we didn't think it was going to be structurally sound. It was only designed to a 0.1 G rating, and we estimated the loads of shaking it around as that was moved over would be more than 3 times that. Originally, we had planned to bring it back in the shuttle payload bay, but this was now after Columbia. And people were concerned that if we had another disaster like Columbia and you had 130 some kilograms of toxic ammonia in it, it could be a really bad day. And we didn't want to have that happen. So we talked about maybe putting it, going out on a spacewalk, detaching it, putting it somewhere else. But we really couldn't think of any good way to do it or find any place that would hold it any better. So then my team was given the puzzle, why don't you just throw it away? Now, over the years on the Russian Mir space station, on Skylab, and even in the space station, we've thrown small things away. Like you go out and you assemble something and you've got a small blanket that was covering maybe a thermal shell, you just throw it away. But nothing ever this big. So this was a real question. And this is what we decided to do. So as NASA flight controllers, we started asking a lot of questions. Is it safe to do this? And the big question is, okay, now if you go out and throw away this big, heavy piece of equipment, could it hit the space station? Well, you guys are astronomers. I think a lot of you probably figured this out already. Yeah, the answer is that it could very easily hit the space station. And that, even if you did it very slowly, a small bump, the space station, while it has shielding to prevent from micrometeoroid impacts, it's not designed for something that big, even if it's very slow. You guys know momentum, that could be a bad day. And let's say we can get rid of it where it won't contact the ISS. Orbital mechanics, will it bring it right back? Well, you guys are probably ahead of me on that. Absolutely. It will come right back. It'll be in the same orbit. So one of the things you need to do is see if you could get the ISS out of the way if it comes back. And I'll show you more about it. But basically what it is we have rocket engines on the space station. It normally is there to keep us from, we even at 400 kilometers, we still have, atmospheric drag, and we will re-enter eventually. So it keeps us above that. Plus, we use it whenever debris comes at the space station, either old satellites falling apart or something like that. We occasionally have to do a reboost where we move into a higher orbit and let the debris come below us. So that was one option we'd have to consider. Now, even if all that works, NASA doesn't like to throw out big things that could come down and hit someone. So we were worried about that. So we did all kinds of analysis about that. And the analysis showed that, yes, it would re-enter and survive re-entry. However, the odds of it hitting anything was, 1 in 4,300, which is actually comparable to a Delta IV rocket upper stage. If you see how they launch off of Cape Kennedy, the lower stage, of course, will go right into the ocean. The upper stage will come back down on the other side of the Earth, but the odds are that it won't hit anything. So we felt that at least part was pretty reasonable. So how do you throw it away? Now, they would have to do a spacewalk, go outside there. Here's a schematic of that solar array truss I was talking about, the P6. Here's where the astronaut could put what's called a foot restraint. And I'll show you a picture of it, but it's basically just a big metal device that they can basically strap their feet into it. Because I think Newton's law that if you push off some big massive object, you're just going to go in the opposite direction. So unless you have your feet really well constrained, you're not going to have a good day pushing off this big object. But the problem is with the foot restraint there, and this is where the EAS was attached. You basically had a very small cone of 28 degrees half angle to throw this thing at, where if it was this much closer, you're just going to hit structure, and that's going to be bad. And if you go much further out here, you could start hitting this structure. So we said, well, maybe you could bend that foot restraint and get a little bit of an angle. We could get a little bit more of an angle, but you could see it wouldn't take much to hit some structure. Now, if you or I were taking a big piece of equipment and we were zero gravity and we just kind of threw this thing, the odds are you could do that pretty easily. But imagine you're also going to be in a giant spacesuit, which has very little flexibility. So you're like the Michelin man in zero gravity, in the darkness, trying to throw this out. It's not that easy. So one of the things we thought about doing and figured out was, well, why don't we use the robotic arm? So what we decided to do was have an astronaut at the end of the robotic arm holding this EAS and have that robotic arm positioned in front of the space station. That way, if they throw the EAS this way, I mean, you're out in front of the space station. I mean, it's not going to recontact anything. Now, I know someone there sitting there going, well, wait a second. If you have this robotic arm, why didn't you just grab it and fling it out and not have to have an astronaut standing there? Well, remember when I said it was a pin that you kind of grabbed on? What you would have had to do is push it and slowly release that at just the right time. And if those cables caught onto it, you would, do something like this, which could maybe break the arm or swing into something and hit something. Or maybe you just get unlucky and it does some motion where it's rotating out. Not good. So we figured the best thing was to have an astronaut hold it at the front of the space station and just push it away that way. Easy, right? Well, first of all, how fast do you have to throw it? As I mentioned, at 400 kilometers, we still have atmospheric drag. So, just like throwing something in water, it will drag back on you. If you throw something, like a cover or disc or a piece of cloth, has very high drag in the atmosphere, it's going to tumble very quickly, decay, burn up, no problem. But small, hard, compact objects like a bullet or something like that won't drag as much and it'll stay in orbit for a long time. That's why we have all these pieces of debris up there. And it turns out that if you know what ballistic number is, it's basically a measurement of the drag of an object. It turns out the EAS, if you calculate, had the exact same drag as the ISS, which what that means is, let's say this is the ISS and you just gently release the EAS, they're going to go off together because they got exactly the same drag. So that's not good. So we just have to find out how to throw it. Now, if the ISS is going in orbit around this way, what you want to do is, now, like I said, if you just released it, it's going to be in the exact same orbit as the ISS. But if you throw it in the opposite direction as the ISS is going, Newton's laws of physics are just going to say, well, it's going to be in a lower orbit. It's going to do something like this. Now, its apogee is going to be at the same altitude, but remember we said the ISS could move to a higher orbit. So if we throw it in the opposite direction of the ISS, that gets us a little better orbit. I'll say more about that in a second. Well, how fast do you have to throw it? Well, we're NASA, so we went off and ran all kinds of different computer analysis. And these different curves are basically the range from station as a function of time. And down here in the lower left is when you throw it away. So if you look at these little curves here, like the white and red, there's kind of a little bit of a bump here. And what these are showing is about 5 centimeters a second throw speeds, and at different altitudes, 330, 335, 340. And you guys are probably all aware that the Earth's atmosphere is not static either. You know, depending on solar activity, the Earth's atmosphere may be higher or lower. So that's why we were looking at different altitudes. So we said if they could throw it at, if the astronaut could throw it at 5 centimeters a second, you would see, if you look here, I don't know if you can read this well, but it's the time is 12 hours. So about 12 hours later, it could potentially be in the same spot as the ISS. Now, if you could throw it at 16 centimeters a second, you can go, and now you're actually, this is 1 day and then sometime, so at least a day. So our goal was to throw this thing away at least 16 centimeters a second, but we needed at least 5 centimeters a second would be 12 hours. I'm sorry, the minimum if we did 5 centimeters a second, it would be 12 hours back. So you just push this thing fast, right? Well, no. Because here's a picture of an astronaut on that foot restraint I was talking about. Here's like a little platform, and you might be able to make out a little like bootstrap here. So the feet stick here, and and we have these all over the space station because sometimes the astronauts just kind of need to hold themselves still while they're doing something. Here's the EAS we're talking about. Well, if he pushes this way, we design these foot restraints because if you push something really, really hard and his feet are fixed to the aluminum structure of the space station, what could happen? You could bend that structure. So we were very clever, and in fact, too clever. We built this foot restraint to have what's called a load limiter. So if the astronaut pushed to make the thing go this way, he'd have an acceleration this way, and you might not be able to see it, but where this red arrow is, it's basically going to go boop and break, which is just preventing the forces from going directly into the structure. So if you push too hard, you're going to flop backwards, and what's going to happen? You're going to lose a lot of your energy you're trying to push forward. So we figured out how we could basically bend it to go 90 degrees. So if the astronaut's pushing this way and the force is going that way, well, the load limiter is over here now, and you've basically made your forces perpendicular, so you're not going to bend this over. So they should be able to have a good push. But this is all theory. So how do you test this? And a couple things that we have here. On the lower left here, you'll see a picture. We have at NASA here what we call the precision air bearing floor, which you can think of as a giant air hockey table. It's just a smooth surface that has air, and you can basically, in 2 dimensionals, push something, very easily. So what we decided to do is we could practice pushing this big, heavy refrigerator. Now, of course, it's 2 dimensions. So what we had to do was basically build this fancy structure to hold the astronaut, because the astronaut could only push in 2 dimensions. So to practice pushing this way, we had to lay them on their side And you'll see a video of this in just a second. And what we wanted to do was have them push. Here's actually a picture of the EAS on a platform to float along here. And here's basically where we were going to measure the angle. We have a camera up above him laying on the ceiling, and we can measure the angle. And of course, just using physics, watching it move along the surface here, we can measure the speed. And then note this picture here, this force plate. We also had to measure the forces that were going into here, and I'll say why in a second. But let me change here for a second. Is this, are you now seeing a video?
Yes.
Okay, so this is one of our astronauts practicing, and what you'll see here is his back. He's laying on his side. For example, this blue hat here, this is the head of some people. Here's another head. Here's another head of a person. The astronaut's basically laying on their side on this contraption that kind of makes them simulate that. And here's the EAS, and he's going to wind up, you know, to kind of wind up the pitch and then throw it. Now, of course, notice what his head, what does he see? He sees the Early Ammonia Servicer. He does not see over here. So he's going to have to figure out how to throw it here as fast as he can and as accurate as he can. So here he is, he's kind of winding up and he's getting ready. He's doing a good heave-ho. And then he's going to try and put as much energy from his legs into it and go oomph and push. And see how it's mostly going straight until this guy catches it. Okay, so we saw the video. Now, we had never done anything like this. You know, how much force could the arm take? Now, remember, you couldn't really see it in the video that I didn't show, but the robotic arm was very critical to put all these Tinker Toy pieces together. So we didn't want to break it. And we didn't know how much force it could take. So we also didn't know if the astronaut pushing like you just saw, remember how his back kind of recoiled? If he's on the robotic arm, is it going to be like a giant diving board? That, of course, again, when you're trying to push something, you know, and get as much speed that way, you don't want to lose energy by putting it into the arm or damaging it. Well, we started off with basic physics. We assumed a rigid astronaut and basically did a forcing function calculation. And, you know, we just know that that's not accurate because there's too much motion and absorption in there. So we actually, I mentioned that plate that was attached to where his feet were. We actually put sensors in there and went out and measured after doing this a bunch of times how much forces were going in there and seeing how much it was. So what did we find out? We weren't going to break the arm, and it looked like he could routinely get about 50 centimeters a second velocity. Now remember, if we said 5 centimeters a second, it would come back in 12 hours. So 50 is 10 times better than that. So that's really good. And the tip of the arm didn't move a whole lot, so we weren't worried about that. The brakes that hold it in position might do a little slipping, but that was not dangerous. So it was all good. And the key thing here is a steady moment, meaning do it gentle. Don't do a herky jerk and push real fast. But we still have to dodge it because whether it comes back 12 hours or 15 hours or 20 hours, it's coming back. So we calculated the trajectory and how quickly is it moving or separating? Well, we track the space station from powerful ground radar, but if two things separate from the space station, I think you guys are probably well aware if you're trying to resolve stars or planets or bodies, they have to be well enough separated for you to do that. Well, it takes about 10 to 12 hours for two things to move apart enough for the ground to resolve it. Well, remember, it could be back in 12 hours, so that wasn't good enough. So we wanted to make sure that we had the right trajectory, because let's say, for example, he got lucky and instead of pitching it in such a way, he got a really good speed, but it actually went to a higher orbit. You know, we don't want to, if the EAS is going to be here, we don't want to reboost into that orbit. So we had to figure things out. Now on the space station, there's some external cameras. We had no radar gun or anything like that. So basically what we did is use these cameras and did a basic poor man's triangulation. And, you know, people think of rocket scientists that we probably had this computer and we said, computer, calculate trajectory, and it graphed us up for it. No, we literally had these camera views of the astronaut, and we took plastic acetate, stuck it over the camera views, and they made tick marks and a stopwatch. And we said, okay, you know, with the background of the truss or whatnot, you know, calculate how fast it was going. So we used these two camera views, and this is basically what we did. So here's one camera view looking one way, here's the other camera view. And we digitized it and syncretized it. And we also practiced this. But we figured in about 3 hours, they could get a rough trajectory with about a 20% accuracy. And here's just a picture. You know, oh yeah, it's very easy. You've got these views here. Well, remember, we're going around and every 90 minutes we have a sunset. So you can't go, get ready to throw it, get ready to throw it. Oh, it's sunset. Now you can't see it. So we also had to time around that. So, you know, it was just all these wrinkles that we had to pile up. Okay, so we figured out how fast he can throw it. And just to be clear, I keep saying he. It ended up being Clay Anderson that did this, but we actually trained 2 astronauts, Sunny Williams, but things got delayed and she didn't do it. But that's why I say he. So we know how fast he could throw it. We could calculate its trajectory, and then we still have to dodge it at some point, hopefully not very quickly. So we can use the Russian service module, has those rocket engines I was mentioning to take it into a higher orbit. But you wanted a retrograde motion jettison. Remember I showed you that orbit earlier, and I said ISS is going this way, and we wanted a jettison in the opposite direction just to use Newton's laws to our advantage. The problem is the arm is in the front of the station and the engines are in the back of the station. What does that mean? Well, it means if you want to push this off in a retrograde motion, meaning opposite of the orbit, you have to flip the space station around to do this. So you get on one end and you have to do this under 12 hours. And we're NASA, we also always wanted to have a chance to do 2 reboost attempts so that if something went wrong with the first one, as happens in space, we could get a second one off. So basically what we had to do is go out on a spacewalk, get on the arm in the front of the space station, push the EAS off, get the astronaut back in, flip the space station around, perform a reboost, and then have potential time to do another one if something goes wrong. So basically, this is what I just said. We had to maneuver to a negative velocity vector, basically fly backwards, perform the EAS jettison, get into the pot, do that flip, do the reboost, and try again. So we're now getting to the point where we're putting it all together. You saw the video of him practicing on the air-bearing floor, pushing it, and that's one way. We also have a neutral buoyancy lab, which is basically a giant tank of water. And here's a picture of them practicing it here in the upper right. Now, the advantage of this is obviously when you're holding something, it feels buoyant in water. But if you try to push it, you've got the drag of the water. So that doesn't help you there. And we also have a virtual reality lab. This is him practicing pushing it away in virtual space. So we have the virtual reality, we have the water buoyancy, we have that air-bearing floor. Those are all the things that we use to practice. And that was just kind of putting it together. I think you can hear some of the space-to-ground audio. So here's Clay Anderson, and this is low resolution, I apologize. We didn't have high-resolution cameras then. So here he is on the robotic arm. Now here's the solar array. You will notice it moving a little bit as time goes along here. Here he's getting ready to do his he-hove. Now the solar array is actually off to the side. So it's not going to hit it. But here's the jettison. Now, what's the first thing you guys probably notice? This is basically this angle where this PMA, this black thing, is the front of the space station. And that was basically the direction we wanted it to go. So you'll see here, see how it, if you can see my mouse, this is the direction we wanted it to go. And here's another side view of it. And it's going down to the side. Now this is a key thing here. This is from his helmet view camera. And what do you notice? It looks like it's right in front of him. So we'll get to that in a second, but so once he's released it, there is nothing we can do. We are in the hands of Newton at that point. So on the positive side, he got 36.8 centimeters a second. So I'm sure you guys probably all remember your trig. And even with the angle that he got, which was 43 degrees, we still got much more than 5 centimeters a second in the velocity vector. So we were safe. So we had at least 12 hours. But believe me, remember I said it took them about 3 hours to calculate that. So for about 3 hours, we have a saying at NASA, what we call a high pucker factor. So we were a bit nervous. Now, fortunately, the attitude maneuver and reboost went perfectly. And this is probably the most important theme that I can give you out of this talk. Even with that problem, and I know you've all seen Apollo 13, or I hope you have, and if you haven't, you need to go out and see it. And if you have, go out and see it again. That movie is so accurate that we actually use it for training our flight controllers. But you remember when Gene Kranz goes, failure's not an option? That's truly one of our mottos. And that's why we trained it so many different ways. We figured we needed 5 centimeters a second, but we trained them to try and get 40 or something, because you don't know what's going to go wrong. So what happened? Well, on the ground, we didn't have any true weightlessness. So when he was trying to figure out, remember, he had a refrigerator in front of his face. He couldn't see anything. So he basically had to go what his knees felt like. So he had to guesstimate from that. There's also one other thing. In the lab, when you're laying on the side, he could see the ceiling a little bit, or he could see the floor a little bit. But from where he was standing on the end of the arm, he had nothing. He had the blackness of space. So he had no reference angle. So that's why it went that way. How long was it in orbit? These different curves were different estimates, depending on the Earth's atmosphere, how long it was going to stay. This was kind of the minimum time we thought, maximum time, about average. And this is when it came down. That's 2008. That was like around November of 2008. And where did it come down? Well, it came down like a meteor and off of Australia. And for those of you who remember that Skylab re-entered and parts of it hit Australia, right, they're probably beginning to think we have something against them. So that was the jettison. I told you we always have patches and stuff. It turns out we had never done anything that big, but after we kind of figured out how to do it, the Space Station Program Office said, you know what, we've got 3 other really big things. Could you throw it away? We created a special patch for that because we felt like we were now jettisons are us. Now,
how long did it take from the time you got the quote unquote order to do the project till the astronaut threw it?
Well, they had spent about a year kind of kicking ideas around. And then when I got assigned to this project, they said, okay, we need you to figure out what to do. And you've got 6 months. So it took us 6 months of very dedicated work of planning all the specifics that I just showed you in the training and then executing it. Now, is there any other questions on that? I can go a little bit more about what I'm working on. And then if you want to open any question on what I'm working on, that EAS jettison or anything about space station, I'd be happy to do it.
I
So
thought your patch was going to have a garbage truck or a sanitation emblem or.
Well, the thing is, any patch we do has to get approved by NASA, so you got to be a little careful of it.
Well, you know, the New York City Department of Sanitation has a nice logo. This is insanely complicated.
It is, and I actually left out a lot of some of the minor details, but to me, that's what rocket scientists, each one of those pieces is not like cutting edge technology or anything, but putting it all together and making it work is what rocket science is.
So did anybody ever think that you're sitting there with a gadget that's loaded with ammonia, which could be considered a propellant, and use that propellant to both drain it and to push it away on a trajectory that you thought through?
We did, but we didn't know. I mean, we literally had images of an astronaut with a screwdriver going out there trying to puncture a hole. And the thing is, if you remember that drawing way back early in the presentation, there was like an outer structure and then the tank was inside, and trying to figure out how to get a hole through that outer structure. Remember, this was temporary. It was never designed to be taken up.
The Russians figured out how to do that recently, it sounds like.
I'm sorry?
The Russians figured out how to put holes in the ISS recently, so.
Yeah. So, I mean, believe me, we did talk like ideas like it, but, you know, and then we were worried if it tumbles, if you don't get it right, you know, plus, of course, you might spray ammonia onto the astronaut and then they'd have to come into the space station and kill everyone. That's not good. So a lot of challenges. Well, the solar panels themselves, sadly, what's going to happen is eventually when space station is shut down, we will have to angle it into the atmosphere and burn it up over the ocean.
And hit
no
Australia.
way to really take it apart.
And hit Australia.
Right.
Hopefully not.
Is there any way you could put it inside one of the unmanned supply vehicles and send it down that
No,
way?
because at the time, the only thing we had was the space shuttle. Now that we have these unmanned, like the SpaceX Cargo Dragon and Cygnus, but they don't have a big enough hole to stick that in. Now, Dragon does have what we call the trunk, which is kind of an outside area that it might have been able to be put in. But again, we only had Dragon, what, 4 or 5 years ago. And this was like 2007 that we had to get rid of it. So we didn't have that option.
Okay.
But go back to that other question. No, engineers don't normally think about end of life or stuff like that. What they do is they're told, design this widget. It has to withstand these forces, or it's going to be in space for 5 years or whatever. Design it and make it as good as possible. Now, engineers will try and say, okay, let's say it's got to take a force of 10 newtons. I'm going to say, I'm going to design it to 30 newtons so it won't break if I miscalculate something. And they might make it 40 newtons just as a measure of good, you know, case. The thing is,
isn't that kind of missing the full? So I'm actually working on a program much more terrestrial in nature, but one of the things I'm building into this program, and it's actually a very complicated program, is, you know, what happens when the program runs end of life? It happens to be a data project, and throwing away data is a lot easier than throwing away a refrigerator, but we're thinking about what to do. I'm thinking about what to do with end of life with this thing, and also thinking about what happens if I get hit by a bus tomorrow and someone has to pick up my work and run with it. I mean, I'm trying to think about things like, I'm actually kind of surprised that while they're building in all this redundancy and extra strength, that no one's thinking about what to do when it's at end of life.
well, in this particular case, the plan originally was build it. And it was actually a quick thing. It was kind of late in the assembly where someone says, you know what? What happens if we get a hole and the ammonia all leaks out? We'll overheat, everything will die, we'll lose billions of dollars and we'll be dead. So someone said, why don't we build this little EAS, launch it on the shuttle, bring it back in the shuttle when we don't need it anymore. But then Columbia happened and people weren't comfortable bringing it back in the shuttle. So that was just a case. Now, engineers design what they are told to design. We operations people, and Josh can probably tell you more about this too, you know, we spend our whole, we lay awake at night going, what if I have to do this? What if this? So when something's being designed and they can bring us in and give us time to go talk to them, we give them all kinds of ideas. You might want to do this. You might want to think about this. You might want to add a vent valve so that we could just vent it and have your propulsion force that, something like that. So.
You'll be employed forever with this kind of complexity.
Let's hope so.
I'm not even saying that in a joke. I mean, if you toss this thing into the ocean, and I guess that's one way of doing it. I mean, but this thing is, what's the end of life on the space station? Isn't it another, I would hope it's a much longer period than maybe 5 or 10 years. And then at that point, you're going to have other modules that may need to be upgraded or yep. decommissioned and things like that.
Well, not counting this thing, which was an unusual device. Most of the US side of the space station is modular, designed to be upgradable within certain limits. I mean, if the outer metal structure gives away, there's nothing you can do. But it's got 2 pressure shells. We've got shielding on it, so we've tried to design it to last a long time. We know it can last to at least 2028. People are trying to analyze it and make sure that it can go to maybe 2034. But eventually at some point, some government's going to say, we're tired of spending money on it. So it's going to be a while, but you made a comment, or someone made a comment earlier. This is the US side of it. The Russian side, it's starting to leak. We think it's actually the main structure that's leaking. Now, right now, we've got tape over it. We're trying to figure out how to permanently fix it. But, it's getting old.
Did you
Well,
say
there was also,
tape?
somebody looked like they had made it drilled into it too. Maybe somebody actually on the space station did that, maybe.
Now, the one you're referring to was a while back on the Soyuz, the emergency escape vehicle. And what we believe happened is someone on the ground when they were building it put a drill through the wrong spot. They patched it up, said, hey, it's good to go. And then over time that patch came off and then they had a nice little hole, and that's what they taped over. This newer leak is actually in the main structure of the Russian service module. And yes, right now they have tape over it. Now it's not perfect and it's not ideal, and they're trying to figure out how to fix it permanently. Now for a number of years now, I am still a space station flight director, but I've also been working on what's called the Commercial Crew Program. Now, the space shuttle was retired in 2011, and it was basically after Columbia. The politicians decided it was too expensive, too dangerous. It was time to get rid of the shuttle. It was a beautiful machine, and I understand the logic of that. Now, what would have been smart is to have another vehicle already built so that you could take astronauts up to it. Because when the shuttle retired, the only way to get astronauts to and from the space station was with the Russian Soyuz spacecraft. Now, the Russians know commercialized operations extremely well. Before the shuttle retired, NASA would have to, in kind, we can't pay the Russians anything, but in kind, it would cost us about $10 million to train and fly an American to fly on the Russian Soyuz. The day after the space shuttle retired, that went up to $50 million, and it is today about $72 million. Kate just went up on the Soyuz last week, and she's hopefully the last seat we paid for, but that was about $72 million that we had to do. But Congress did not allocate the money to this program for a number of years. So unfortunately, you can see in 2010, we decided to build a new spacecraft, and in 2011, the shuttle was done. So we had a gap until now. Now, what NASA decided to do was to provide seed money to various companies, commercial companies, that's the new mantra, and have them develop a spacecraft to take astronauts to the space station. Now, in the past, the way NASA worked as a government agency would say, okay, I need this spacecraft. I want it to do this, this, and this. You guys tell me how much it's going to cost, and we'll pick the low bidder. And that's how it would be. And then NASA would own that intellectual property, that spacecraft, that design, everything about it. But that's very expensive. And what we decided to do here to be cheaper was to provide some money. We'll give some companies, whoever wants to bid, and say, look, we'll give you $50 million to test a design of a spacecraft. And then after you've done that, maybe of $50 million more to do the next thing about it. Maybe your parachutes are the thing that are going to be tricky. Why don't you design some parachutes and we'll pay you for it? And so that's what it would do. So instead of buying it, NASA was going to say, we'll give you some seed money, but you have to put your own money in as well. Now, the advantage is NASA helps them. The company then puts some of their own money and build it, but then they own the intellectual property. They can take tourists up if they want. They could film a movie in it. They could do whatever they want with it because they now own a spacecraft that NASA will then rent back to take its astronauts to and from the space station. So that was a totally different model that they were going to do. And when it started out, various companies, Sierra Nevada, you may have heard of them. They're an aerospace company. Blue Origins, I don't know how many of you know about them. That's the Jeff Bezos company. He owns Amazon. He just recently, I think last week, they had a suborbital flight that was successful. He's the quiet tinkerer that you don't hear much about, and then he does something cool. SpaceX, I'm sure you guys have all heard about, and then Boeing were some of the big companies that started out on this. Now, each one of these companies kind of built their own design. NASA gave them a few high-level requirements. They kind of designed their own thing, built it. Now, SpaceX had actually been doing unmanned cargo vehicles under the same model with ISS for several years when this came out. Or actually, they were on contract to do it. They didn't fly until a little bit later. But SpaceX already had their vehicles, so they were going, and they were eventually, they were selected as one of the two finalists. Boeing was the other company. Now, Boeing, you know, Big Mama Boeing, big aerospace company that's been around. And what NASA basically decided was, look, we're going to pick two companies. One is kind of the new space, the up and starter, you know, doesn't have much of a background or reputation, might be a little too daring and risk, you know, taking. And Boeing, which is kind of the old gray mother and is more of a sure thing. Now, SpaceX was already operating. Boeing was new to this game. And rather than, and SpaceX had their own team. They build their rockets in California. They launch their rockets from Florida. They operate everything from their own mission control in California. They do it all. Boeing decided to use United Launch Alliance rockets out of Florida. They build their spacecraft there in Florida, but they didn't want to develop their own team of flight controllers like myself that you have to build from scratch, build a mission control, train them and everything like that. And they're like, wait a second, we got NASA. So they decided to partner with us. I jumped ahead here. In 2014, they down selected to two, the SpaceX I mentioned and the Boeing Starliner. And another thing that Boeing does is, remember when I said old models, NASA tells the requirements, they buy it, they own it. Orion spacecraft, now that's different. That can't go to the space station. It's too big, too heavy, all kinds of other problems like that. But NASA owns that. That's basically publicly available data. If you said, I want to design a spacecraft just like Orion, you could go to NASA and say, give me the blueprints. We'd have to hand you the blueprints because it's a public thing. So Boeing said, hand us the blueprints. We're going to build something very similar. So they decided to shortcut a little bit that way, you know, save themselves some development. And then have NASA fly it. And that's me. So I am the head of the flight control team that went to operate this. And we're called Mission Operations. And I'll say a little bit more about that. And I'm the lead flight director for this operation. Now, let me just take a moment to talk about Dragon. Because I'm working on Boeing, I'm kind of limited on what I can say, but some of it you may know. Now, for commercial crew, they had to have 2 test flights an uncrewed flight and a crewed flight. Dragon, SpaceX, they had their uncrewed flight last March. They had their crewed flight this last May. Astronauts Bob and Doug went up there. They were launched in May and they landed last August. The mission was successful. Now for a while, and both these missions, all these missions were supposed to go years ago, but funding was delayed. And then SpaceX, in 2017, I think it was, their spacecraft exploded during a test. But that's why you do tests. But they kept plodding at it. They made their test flights, and now they are a certified vehicle to take astronauts to the space station. And that's why Kate Rubins went up on the last Soyuz. And next month we will launch our first official increment using the SpaceX Dragon. Now, so that 6 months or a year from now, you don't hear something go, Dr. Bob lied to me. There will be astronauts that go up on a Russian Soyuz in the future, but we're not going to pay them. What we're going to do is we're going to take a Russian cosmonaut and take him up on one of these vehicles. So it's a quid pro quo type thing, but we're not going to pay for seats anymore. And the reason why you do that is if we can't buy seats and only Russians go up on the Soyuz and only Americans go up on, say, Dragon or Starliner, and then let's say there's an emergency and one of those vehicles have to go home, you only have Americans or Russians on the space station. We won't get into that political discussion.
Right.
So here's what Dragon looks like. It's a little bit more of a stylized conical section that has this cover over the docking system, but it can autonomously go up and dock with the space station. That was another requirement that NASA wanted with these vehicles, is they had to be completely autonomous. In reality, nothing's completely autonomous because software is a lot more complicated in this business than people think. And here's a picture of Bob and Doug in front of their spacecraft.
Just back on that other slide, Dr. Bob, can you tell us why the connector that comes off the ISS has got a crook in it? Why isn't it like a straight pipe? Why does it have that angle, that bend in it?
That's a very good question. And I don't have a model or picture handy, but if you can picture, if this is the ISS and the shuttle would come up and dock, well, let me put it this way. I can't quite do it, but picture the shuttle this way. This is the cargo that the humans lived in. This is the payload bay, and the airlock would be out here. Well, this is where you would dock.
Oh yeah.
And you needed that little crook to go around the space shuttle, because otherwise you would collide into it.
Got it.
Nothing really clever on it. So. Okay. Another cool thing that the SpaceX does, which you probably heard about, is their booster lands back on a barge in the ocean, and then they can reuse it. So that's really cool. This is, I really love this because when I was in college, I remember I was in a physics class and they were talking about how this could never be done. It wasn't physically possible. And it's so cool to see that it's like, yeah, it can be done. Now, Starliner, I can tell you a little bit more about it, but it's the same sort of thing. Instead of SpaceX at Boeing, we launch it using a United Launch Atlas rocket here in Kennedy Space Center. It goes up to the space station autonomously and docks. Then it comes home, part of it re-enters. The command module, which is where the astronauts stay, land here. Now, SpaceX lands in the water. We use airbags to basically cushion the impact so that we can land on land. Why does it matter? Well, Apollo used water. It's big, it's easy to hit. Land is easy to hit too, but you want to land in the right spot. So it's a little bit harder to land. But the thing is, one of the reasons why land might be a little better is, when you've been in space for 6 months and then you come back to the Earth, you get woozy, you're lightheaded because your blood's not used to, pooling in your legs. And then imagine sitting in the water doing this. Almost every Apollo astronaut threw up all over the spacecraft when they got back. So that's one advantage to doing the land. But then after it's recovered, it's refurbished and relaunched. And both Dragon and Starliner are completely reusable. And then we do the mission operations here in Houston. Now, I mentioned the 2 Dragon missions. You probably remember hearing about a Boeing mission last year, and it didn't quite go as planned. So let me tell you a little bit about that. That was last December. We operated out of Mission Control here in Houston. Here's a picture pre-launch. Here's the capsule sitting on top of the rocket. It looks a little bit like an Orion vehicle, but not quite, a little bit smaller. Here's a picture of the launch. It was a beautiful launch. Here's a picture of you're seeing the solar arrays, these black little hex squares. That's the solar array on the back end of the Starliner as it's separating from the rocket. So you may have heard the mission didn't go quite right. And the reason for that is the mission elapse time is a timer that begins at 0 when the vehicle lifts off the pad. So as soon as it starts lifting, the clock starts running. You've probably seen the movies. The clock is running. That's exactly what it is. Now, this is an orbital, an autonomous vehicle. So the burn, called the orbital insertion burn, was timed to occur at exactly 8 minutes on the clock. Well, it turns out this mission elapse time was set wrong. What had happened is that it accidentally started counting down from 0 the day before. And when it launched, everyone thought it was going to reset to 0, and it didn't. And the autonomous software says, okay, I'm waiting for 8 minutes to turn on the engine. That was way in the past. So it never burned. Okay. As we kind of talked earlier, shit happens. We had planned for things like that. So here's a picture of the team of us sitting in mission control. And we said, wait a second, the autonomous burn didn't go off. We'll command it manually. So we start getting ready to send these commands to command it. And we couldn't get a good radio link. So we're trying to send the command up and we couldn't talk to it. And eventually we got a solid link. The burn went off. The problem is once in orbit, well, let me get to that in a second. We were able to get a stable orbit. And here's a picture from inside the spacecraft. We had a dummy in there taking measurements and stuff. And we were able to do some checkouts. But the problem is, actually, I guess I don't have it here. The problem is, by the time we got that stable orbit, we had used so much fuel because basically what you can think of is we were doing, Newton's law. We were doing a parabola, and what you want to do is when you're here, do the burn and go higher. Well, what was happening, since we didn't do the burn, by the time we actually got the burn off, we kind of did that. And it took so much fuel there to get back in orbit, we didn't have enough fuel to go to the space station. So that was a case where one big software error, and it was nothing we operations could do anything about, caused a real problem.
Wasn't there another one too that affected the separation of the crew module from the service module?
Yeah, that's another thing that happened. What happened there was, as soon as that first problem happened, everyone went back and said, go look at all the software and see where we have critical triggers like that. And what they discovered is one of the software that does that separation of that service module you were talking about had a different type of error in it. In fact, basically a plus sign and a minus sign were swapped, and it wasn't going to work right. So we quickly did what we call a data load to say, swap it, and then it worked right at the last minute. And then it re-entered normally. This is a view of the camera outside the window. You can see the re-entry plasma. There's a cover that's coming off there. The parachutes came out. This is it landing in the desert. and everything with the landing went perfect. The airbags just went just fine. Everything landed. We weren't sure how hard it was going to be. The astronauts say that when the Soyuz lands in Kazakhstan on land, they use parachutes there and braking rockets. One astronaut described it to me that it's like someone taking a baseball bat to your back. But they said this was like a little over G landing. It was very soft. They put a cover over it so sand doesn't get in it as they get ready to prepare it. So what happened was Boeing had elected to save money. They wanted to be a little bit, instead of the big, one of the reasons NASA liked Boeing was because they were used to working with them. They had lots of paperwork and documentation, and NASA liked that, whereas SpaceX was like, here's a drawing, let's go build this. Are you okay with that? And NASA was always very nervous with that. But Boeing was trying to be a little more nimble, but they decided to cut an end-to-end test. So they never did that software test, and they didn't catch that code error that did not set the timer right. Now, after this happened, since everything else went fine, but we did not successfully get to the space station uncrewed, Boeing decided to refly the flight. And we've been upgrading the software for the last year, doing a lot more testing on it. We've also been working on the crewed flight. That'll be the following one. But next year, we'll launch this mission unmanned. We'll redo it. We'll go to the space station, and then we'll have a crewed flight test. And actually, I just realized this is an old picture because about a week and a half ago, Chris Ferguson, that center astronaut there in that picture, decided not to fly on this. He was actually the commander of the last shuttle mission, and Boeing had hired him to be the first private astronaut. But he has decided that family life is a little more important, and since it's like a year away from the flight, he decided that it was time to take a break from that. And that should hopefully go up later next year. And that one will go to the space station. They may stay a week, they may stay 6 months. We'll have to see how long that works out. And then I'll end on a final plug. There's a book out here. Here's the website that if you want to read about the space station, it's a good book. It's I'll be honest, it's a big book. So if you go to that website, there's a free PDF. I might not print it out if I were you. Unless you've got a lot of printer paper, but the book is available electronically if you want to read it. And it talks a lot about how we operate the space station. For the real nerds, it goes into a lot of detail about the spacecraft systems, but half the chapters do tell you what I do and tells you stories kind of like what I was telling you tonight. So hopefully you enjoyed it. I will be happy to talk anything now on space station or any questions that you want if you have time. I know it's getting late there, but it's up to you.
Thanks, Dr. Bob.
Can we come back to your refrigerator?
Sure.
So a very naive question. How difficult is it to build and operate in space some very small radio controlled rockets that you would have attached to your refrigerator and just controlled out of the space station, move it away, and then give it a big kick once it's safe away from the space station?
That is not a naive question at all. That's a very good question. So you definitely could do that. In fact, we now, and again, this is something that blows my mind a little bit. When I started out on space station, 22 years ago, people were talking about little satellites that were like this big called nanosatellites. And I remember thinking, what can you do with such a little satellite? We are now launching these all the time from space station because now the technology is here where you can build small things like that, that are pretty robust, pretty cheap. SpaceX is doing it for, they want to do the constellation of internet provider satellites. People are launching little satellites to track marine ships, all kinds of different satellites.
Ham radio repeaters.
Exactly.
Yep.
And it would not take much. I know some of them use like ion propulsion because, you don't need a whole lot of propulsion, but yes, you could have easily done something like that. Let me rephrase that. You could do something like that back at the time frame that we were talking, to design something that would be able to go outside and attach to the space, to this EAS refrigerator, safely move it away. That probably was beyond our technology and capability at that time. Could we have done it? Given enough money and time? Absolutely. We didn't have the money nor the time, so we had to come up with a little more low fidelity way, but it's theoretically possible.
Dr. Bob, if I could just switch over just to talk back again about the SLS. Boeing has obviously had a lot of problems here recently with their aircraft, and then what you described too. And when NASA came out with this, they gave $4.2 billion to Boeing and $2.6 billion to SpaceX for really doing the same job. And now it looks like the Boeing's going to charge something around $90 million per astronaut, and SpaceX is going to charge $55 million per astronaut. And of course, with SpaceX, they're reusable, whereas Boeing is not. What is the real future of Boeing, being able to get people back and forth reliably to the ISS, and with a price that's not exorbitant, that the taxpayer doesn't feel that they're really getting stuck on?
Yeah, that's a totally.
It's a loaded question, I know. It's
a fair question. Now, where it gets a little complicated, definitely SpaceX has been cheaper. There's no doubt about that. It's a little bit apples to oranges because SpaceX said, here's your design. And NASA said, okay, that's great, we'll buy it. And then like a year later, they go, well, wait a second. We'd like it to do this. We'd like it to do that. And SpaceX said, okay, we can do that. Give us a little more money. And I don't, I could add that up. I don't know what it is. I still don't think it comes to the same as the Boeing.
But Boeing just went back and asked for another couple $100 million just recently too, didn't they?
Well, for the SLS, that's the space launch system, which is taking the Orion to the moon. But you're right.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. Right.
That's
right.
totally behind budget, and over budget and behind schedule too. And I'll be honest, personally, it's a little frustrating. Operations, we did everything right. But there was nothing we actually saved the mission, and that was the good thing, so we did that, but we didn't get to do the mission we wanted to. But you're right, Boeing has had some real problems that they're struggling with, and one nice thing is they've been like, we're going to do this right. They didn't have to refly the mission. I think NASA, we looked at it and said, look, did they accomplish enough that we feel safe to put some astronauts on it? And actually, everyone felt that we would be okay doing that mission again. But Boeing said, look, we realized we embarrassed ourselves. They wanted to try to make it right. So they said, let's do the mission again. So that's what we've been working in. We've been spending the last year saying, okay, remember 2 years ago when we said you should do this test and you should maybe fix this software? Now they're doing those tests and fixing that software.
Great, thank you.
I got a couple questions queued up here. One is maybe a little morbid, but I think it's an interesting topic. Kind of makes me picture a scene in 2001 and bring us back to Jettison's R Us. If there was a death in the space station and you had to bring an astronaut back, would they bring them back in a in a module, or is jettisoning them an option using your techniques?
Well, besides the fact that I think trying to ask an astronaut to jettison their fellow astronaut, I would not want to be the flight director asking that. No, we would not do that.
HAL 9000 doing it, So.
Right.
No, what we actually, it's a morbid question, but it is, we try to think of everything. We have, a body bag on station. We would return them in a vehicle, one of the cargo vehicles.
And the Russians have lots of vodka, so it kind of works out.
Well, sailors were dropped out to sea, didn't they?
Yeah, and I'm sure there's some astronauts that probably would be happy with that. They probably would consider it the ultimate way to go, but NASA's official policy is no, we would bring them back.
Bob, can you give us an idea of the demography of the, my graduate student will be very happy to learn. So what do you have? 60% engineer, 10% physicist?
Only one astronomer. But it's actually a fairly diverse group. Yeah, we're mostly engineers, but there's physics majors too. But there's math majors, different types of engineers, electrical, mechanical, fluid engineers. But I even work with an English major. She was a former English major and decided she really wanted to get into this stuff and went back to school a bit and then got hired at the right time.
So these are not PhD?
No. In fact, I'm now a NASA civil servant, but I was hired by United Space Alliance in '97. And literally the month after I got the Employee of the Month award, they then sent me notes saying that they were not allowed to hire PhDs anymore. And I was like, these are mixed messages you're sending me. What are you trying to say? Most people are bachelors. We do have a few masters and a few PhDs. And a PhD doesn't make you any better or worse. We really want smart, energetic people. This is hard work. It takes long hours, but like we'll train you. I mean, if someone came, like I said, an education major, if they're smart and motivated, we'll give them the training that they need to do. It just, depends on what their interests are. And to finish that question too, you didn't ask for it. You were talking about the thing, a lot of women, and a fair representation of minorities too.
Was there anything else, Alex?
Just compliments, thanking him for the talk, which saying was really interesting. I certainly found it so too.
Yeah, I did
pleasure.
too.
And you know what? I'll be totally honest. I know at 3 a.m. tonight, you're going to be laying in bed and you're going to go, oh, I have a question. I know Alex has my email. I'd be happy to field it. Just, reach out.
You sent me your cell phone. You really made a mistake. I got your cell phone number.
That's fine. And also,
bad call.
Guys are down here in Houston. After the pandemic, when we can actually do tours of mission control, please drop me a line. I'd love to show you what we do.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
That's great. Well, great. So that's a wrap then. And don't forget, next month, we have Yale's Priya Natarajan. She's going to be talking about black holes. And I can't wait to speak with her. She's great. Alex Filipenko, December 15th. Joshua Tan is scheduled for January 19th. And University of Minnesota's Lucy Fortson on February 16th. And April 20th is Dr. Lisa Upton, Space Systems Research Corporation. So lots and lots of speakers, lots of great stuff. And tonight was just another great one too. So thank you, Dr. Bob. And let's stick a fork in this. Thanks for everybody. And we'll see you soon.
Thank you very much.